Imagine holding a job so intimate, so personal, that your very life depended on the satisfaction of a single man. A job where one mistake could mean exile, imprisonment, or death. Where your hands would touch the most private parts of the most powerful person in the kingdom, day after day, year after year. This wasn't just any job. This was the position of the groom of the stool, one of the most coveted and dangerous positions in medieval royal courts. For over 400 years, European kings employed professional butt wipers. These weren't servants or slaves. They were nobles, educated men who fought for the privilege of cleaning the royal posterior. They lived in luxury, commanded armies, and influenced the fate of nations. But why? What dark secrets lie behind this bizarre royal tradition that history books barely whisper about? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on one of medieval history's most uncomfortable truths. The year is 1485. Henry Tudor has just claimed the English throne after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Among his first royal appointments, one stands out as particularly unusual. Hugh Dennis, a wealthy landowner from Gloucestershire, has been selected for what many would consider the most prestigious position in the royal household. Not as treasurer, not as military commander, but as the king's personal body servant. His official title, Groom of the Stool. To modern ears, this sounds like the ultimate humiliation. But in medieval England, Hugh Dennis had just won the lottery. The Groom of the Stool wasn't just responsible for the king's bathroom needs. He was the keeper of royal secrets, the man who saw the king at his most vulnerable and often his most trusted advisor. The position came with a massive salary, extensive lands, and influence that rivaled that of dukes and earls. But how did we get here? How did wiping the royal bottom become a pathway to power and prestige? The roots of this bizarre tradition stretch back to the very nature of medieval kingship itself. In an age when kings were believed to be appointed by God, every aspect of their lives took on sacred significance. They didn't just rule by divine right, they lived by it. Every meal, every prayer, every bodily function was part of an elaborate ritual that reinforced their connection to the divine. Medieval Europeans believed that the king's body was literally different from that of ordinary mortals. Royal blood was thought to possess healing properties. The king's touch could cure diseases, particularly scrofula, a tuberculosis infection of the lymph nodes that was known as the king's evil. Thousands would travel hundreds of miles just for the chance to be touched by royal hands. If the king's touch could heal, then surely every part of his body held similar power. This included his most private moments. The person who tended to these needs wasn't performing a menial task. They were participating in a sacred ritual. They were the only individuals trusted with the king's most intimate vulnerabilities. Consider this: in medieval times, privacy as we understand it today simply didn't exist, especially for royalty. Kings dressed, ate, and even slept in the presence of dozens of courtiers. But there was one moment each day when even a king needed solitude, or at least the illusion of it. This created an opportunity for unprecedented intimacy and trust. The groom of the stool became the one person who saw the king not as a divine ruler, but as a human being with very human needs. This intimacy bred a unique form of influence. While other courtiers competed for moments of the king's attention during formal audiences, the groom had hours of uninterrupted. It was during these private moments that some of the most important decisions in European history were made. Hugh Dennis, Henry VII's first groom of the stool, understood this power intimately. Within months of his appointment, he had become one of the king's closest confidants. Henry trusted him with state secrets that he shared with no one else, not even his queen. Denys used this position to accumulate vast wealth and influence, eventually becoming one of the richest men in England. But the job came with extraordinary risks. The groom of the stool was privy to the king's most private thoughts, fears, and weaknesses. They knew when the king was ill, when he was afraid, when he doubted his own decisions. This knowledge made them incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous. The position required a delicate balance. Too little attention to detail could be seen as disrespect or incompetence. Too much ambition could be viewed as a threat. The groom had to be trustworthy enough to handle state secrets, competent enough to manage the royal household, and diplomatic enough to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, all while maintaining the pretense that their primary job was cleaning the royal posterior. This wasn't a position for the squeamish or the ambitious in the traditional sense. It required a specific type of person, someone who could find power in service, influence in intimacy, and prestige in what others might consider degradation. The successful groom of the stool was part confessor, part bodyguard, part advisor, and part servant. The salary reflected these multiple responsibilities. By the reign of Henry VIII, the groom of the stool earned more than most earls and commanded a staff of dozens. They lived in apartments within the royal palace, dined at the king's table, and traveled with the court wherever it went. Their families were granted noble titles. Their children married into the highest ranks of society. Yet despite all these privileges, the position remained fundamentally precarious. Royal favor could disappear overnight. A single mistake, a moment of perceived disloyalty, or simply a change in the king's mood could result in disgrace, exile, or death. The higher you climbed in the medieval court, the farther you had to fall. This paradox, a position that was simultaneously the most intimate and the most dangerous in the kingdom, would define the role of the groom of the stool for centuries to come. It was a job that attracted the most ambitious and capable men of their age, precisely because it offered both unparalleled access to power and unparalleled risk. As we'll see, the men who took on this role weren't just servants. They were power brokers, kingmakers, and sometimes the only thing standing between their monarch and complete disaster. Their story is one of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the strange ways that power operates in the shadows of history. But to understand why this position became so important, we need to go back even further, to the very origins of royal ceremony and the belief systems that made a professional butt wiper not just acceptable, but essential. To understand why medieval kings needed professional butt wipers, we need to understand how fundamentally different their world was from ours. In the medieval mind, the king wasn't just a political leader. He was a living bridge between heaven and earth, a mortal vessel for divine power. Every aspect of his physical existence was sacred, mysterious, and potentially dangerous. This belief system didn't emerge overnight. It was built on centuries of Christian theology, ancient Roman imperial traditions, and older, darker beliefs about the magical properties of royal blood. By the time the position of groom of the stool was formally established, these ideas had crystallized into an elaborate mythology that surrounded every aspect of royal life. The concept of the divine right of kings held that monarchs were chosen directly by God. This wasn't just a political convenience. It was a deeply held religious belief that shaped every aspect of medieval society. The king's authority didn't come from the consent of the governed, from military conquest, or from noble birth alone. It came from heaven itself. This divine connection manifested in ways that modern people find difficult to comprehend. Medieval chroniclers wrote seriously about kings who could predict the future, control the weather, or communicate with angels. These weren't seen as superstitions. They were accepted facts about the nature of royal power. The king's body itself was believed to possess supernatural properties. Royal touch could cure diseases, particularly scrofula, which was literally called the king's evil because only royal intervention could heal it. Thousands of people suffering from this condition would journey to court, sometimes traveling for months, just for the chance to be touched by royal hands. But this healing power wasn't limited to the king's hands. Medieval medical texts describe the curative properties of royal saliva, royal breath, and even royal bodily waste. Yes, you heard that correctly. The excrement of kings was believed to possess healing properties that could cure everything from headaches to plague. This wasn't just folk belief. It was supported by the medical establishment of the time. Learned physicians wrote treatises on the therapeutic uses of royal bodily fluids. Alchemists sought to distill the essence of royal waste into powerful medicines. The king's chamber pot wasn't just a receptacle, it was a source of literal, liquid gold. Given these beliefs, the person responsible for handling the king's most private bodily functions wasn't performing a degrading task. They were participating in a sacred ritual, handling substances that were believed to be blessed by God Himself. The groom of the stool wasn't just a servant. He was a priest of the royal body, a guardian of divine essence. This sacred responsibility required the highest level of discretion and trustworthiness. The groom knew intimate details about the king's health, his diet, his moods, and his private habits. In an age when any sign of physical weakness could trigger rebellions or foreign invasions, this knowledge was literally a matter of national security. Consider the implications. If the king showed signs of illness, enemies might interpret this as a sign that God had withdrawn His favor. If he appeared weak or vulnerable, rival claimants might see an opportunity to press their own claims to the throne. The groom of the stool was often the first person to detect signs of royal illness or weakness, making him one of the most important figures in the kingdom's defense. The position also required extensive medical knowledge. Medieval grooms of the stool were expected to understand the relationship between the king's bodily functions and his overall health. They monitored color, consistency, frequency, and other details that could indicate disease, poison, or emotional distress. They were part doctor, part detective, and part guardian of state secrets. This medical aspect of the job helps explain why the position was always filled by educated nobles rather than common servants. The groom needed to understand not just the practical aspects of royal hygiene, but the complex web of beliefs and superstitions that surrounded the royal body. He needed to know when to call for physicians, when to keep concerns private, and when to alert the royal council to potential threats. The sacred nature of the king's body also extended to everything that touched it. The royal toilet paper, usually fine linen or silk, was considered holy after use. The chamber pot became a religious artifact. Even the room where the king relieved himself took on sacred significance, often becoming a private chapel where the monarch could pray in solitude. These beliefs created an elaborate protocol around royal bathroom habits. The groom of the stool oversaw every aspect of this ritual, from the preparation of the royal toilet to the disposal of royal waste. Nothing was left to chance or delegated to ordinary servants. Every detail was managed by someone who understood the sacred significance of what they were handling. But perhaps most importantly, the intimate nature of these duties created a unique relationship between king and servant. While other courtiers saw the king only in his public role, surrounded by the pageantry and ceremony of court life, the groom saw him at his most human and vulnerable. This created a level of trust and intimacy that was impossible to achieve through any other means. Kings, despite all their power and divine authority, were still human beings with human needs and human fears. They worried about their health, their relationships, their children, and their legacies. They struggled with doubt, loneliness, and the crushing weight of responsibility. The groom of the stool was often the only person who witnessed these private moments of vulnerability. This intimacy was both the source of the groom's power and the root of his danger. Kings valued the honest counsel of someone who saw them without their royal mask, but they also feared anyone who knew their weaknesses too well. The relationship between king and groom was built on mutual dependency. The king needed someone he could trust completely, and the groom needed royal protection to survive in the dangerous world of medieval politics. The sacred nature of the king's body also meant that any harm to the groom of the stool was considered an attack on the royal person itself. These men were under the king's direct protection, making them effectively untouchable by ordinary nobles or court officials. This protection allowed them to accumulate power and wealth that would have been impossible in any other position. Yet this same sacred status made them targets. Rival courtiers, foreign agents, and rebellious nobles all understood that the surest way to harm or manipulate the king was through the person who had unlimited access to him. The groom of the stool lived in constant danger of assassination, kidnapping, or blackmail. As we'll see, this dangerous intimacy shaped every aspect of how the position developed over the centuries. The men who held this role weren't just servants or even advisors. They were the keepers of royal secrets, the guardians of divine mystery, and sometimes the only thing standing between their king and complete disaster. The position of groom of the stool didn't appear suddenly in medieval courts. It evolved gradually from older traditions of royal service, shaped by the peculiar needs of monarchs who lived their entire lives under public scrutiny. To understand how this role became so powerful, we need to trace its development through some of the most tumultuous periods in European history. The earliest versions of this position can be traced back to the Byzantine Empire, where the emperor's private servants held titles like Keeper of the Imperial Chamber or Guardian of the Sacred Vestments. These positions combined practical household management with ceremonial duties that reinforced the emperor's divine status. The person who dressed the emperor, prepared his private chambers, and attended to his most intimate needs wasn't just a servant. They were participants in an elaborate ritual that maintained the emperor's connection to heaven. When these Byzantine traditions spread to Western Europe through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, they merged with existing Germanic and Celtic customs around royal service. The result was a unique fusion that emphasized both the sacred nature of kingship and the practical needs of medieval rulers who faced constant threats from rivals, rebels, and foreign enemies. The first official groom of the stool in English history was appointed during the reign of Henry VII, but the position had been evolving for decades before it received its formal title. Earlier English kings had relied on what were called yeomen of the chamber, or gentlemen of the privy chamber, trusted servants who managed the king's private quarters and personal needs. What made Henry VII's approach different was the systematic way he organized these private servants into a formal hierarchy. The groom of the stool became the head of what was essentially a shadow government, a group of men who controlled access to the king and managed his most private affairs. This wasn't just about bathroom duties. It was about creating a system that gave the king maximum security and privacy in an age when both were constantly under threat. Henry VII's paranoia was well-founded. He had won his throne through military conquest, and he spent his entire reign fighting off challenges from rival claimants, noble conspiracies, and foreign invasions. He needed people around him who were absolutely trustworthy, completely loyal, and capable of keeping secrets that could determine the fate of the kingdom. Hugh Denys, his first official groom of the stool, was perfectly suited for this role. A minor nobleman from Gloucestershire, Denys had fought alongside Henry at the Battle of Bosworth Field and had proven his loyalty under the most extreme circumstances. He was educated, discreet, and ambitious enough to appreciate the opportunities that the position offered. Under Denys's management, the role of groom of the stool expanded far beyond its original duties. He became responsible for managing the king's private correspondence, controlling access to the royal apartments, and serving as an informal advisor on matters ranging from court appointments to foreign policy. The king's bathroom became a private office where some of the most important decisions in English history were made. This expansion of responsibilities wasn't accidental. Medieval kings faced a fundamental problem. They needed advice from people they could trust, but the formal structures of medieval government, the royal council, the nobility, the church hierarchy, were full of people with their own agendas and loyalties. The groom of the stool, by contrast, owed everything to the king personally. His wealth, his status, and his very survival depended entirely on royal favor. This created a relationship that was both intensely personal and politically crucial. The groom became the king's alter ego, someone who could speak with royal authority in private while maintaining the fiction of humble service in public. He could carry messages, negotiate deals, and make promises that the king couldn't make openly without compromising his royal dignity. The position also served as a form of insurance against the constant threat of assassination that haunted medieval monarchs. The groom of the stool was one of the few people who had regular, private access to the king. If someone wanted to poison or otherwise harm the monarch, they would need to either corrupt the groom or eliminate him first. This made the groom both a target and a bodyguard, someone whose own survival was tied directly to the king's safety. As the position evolved under Henry VII and his successors, it began to attract increasingly ambitious and capable men. These weren't desperate courtiers grateful for any position. They were accomplished nobles, military commanders, and diplomats who saw the role as a pathway to extraordinary power and influence. William Compton, who served as groom of the stool under Henry VIII, exemplified this new breed of royal servant. A tournament champion, successful military commander, and skilled diplomat, Compton could have pursued any number of prestigious positions in the royal government. Instead, he chose to become the king's personal attendant because he understood the unique opportunities that intimate access to royal power could provide. Under Compton's management, the groom of the stool became something approaching a medieval chief of staff. He controlled the king's daily schedule, managed his personal finances, and served as the primary channel of communication between the monarch and his government. Foreign ambassadors learned that the surest way to reach the king was through his groom. Nobles seeking royal favor knew that Compton's support was often more valuable than the backing of dukes or earls. This concentration of informal power in the hands of one man created its own problems. Other courtiers resented the groom's influence and constantly plotted to undermine his position. Foreign governments attempted to bribe or blackmail grooms to gain access to English state secrets. The position became a focal point for court intrigue and international espionage. The groom also had to navigate the delicate balance between serving the king personally and serving the broader interests of the kingdom. Sometimes these loyalties came into conflict, particularly when the king's personal desires conflicted with sound policy or political necessity. The groom might find himself in the impossible position of having to choose between his duty to his monarch and his responsibility to the realm. These challenges were magnified by the highly personal nature of the relationship between king and groom. Unlike other royal advisors, who served institutional roles that could survive changes in personnel, the groom's influence was tied directly to his personal relationship with the monarch. This made the position incredibly powerful, but also incredibly precarious. A groom who fell out of favor faced not just the loss of his position, but potential exile, imprisonment, or death. The same intimate knowledge that made him valuable also made him dangerous if he turned against his royal master. Kings who dismissed their grooms often felt compelled to eliminate them entirely to protect their own secrets. This dynamic created a unique culture around the position. Successful grooms learned to be simultaneously ambitious and self-effacing, influential and invisible, trusted and expendable. They mastered the art of wielding power without appearing to seek it, of shaping royal policy while maintaining the fiction that they were merely servants. The role also attracted men who understood that traditional paths to power, military conquest, noble birth, church advancement, were limited in their scope and security. The groom of the stool offered something different: access to the ultimate source of power in the medieval world, the monarch himself. For ambitious men who were willing to subordinate their public dignity to their private influence, it represented an irresistible opportunity. As we'll see, this combination of intimate access, enormous responsibility, and constant danger would shape the careers of some of the most fascinating and influential figures in medieval history. The men who held the position of groom of the stool weren't just servants. They were power brokers who operated in the shadows of history, shaping the fate of kingdoms from the most unlikely of positions. If there was ever a golden age for professional royal butt wipers, it was during the reign of Henry VIII. No monarch in English history was more obsessed with the rituals of power, more paranoid about his personal security, or more dependent on the intimate services of his personal attendants. Under Henry, the position of groom of the stool reached the height of its influence and prestige. Henry VIII was a king of enormous appetites, for food, for women, for power, and for the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced his royal authority. He was also a king of enormous anxieties, constantly worried about assassination, rebellion, and the stability of his dynasty. These characteristics made him the perfect monarch to elevate the role of groom of the stool from important court position to one of the most powerful offices in the kingdom. When Henry came to the throne in 1509, he inherited William Compton as his groom of the stool from his father's reign. Compton had already proven his worth under Henry VII, but the young Henry's personality and needs would push the position to new heights of importance and influence. Henry was notorious for his elaborate daily routines. He required assistance with every aspect of his personal care, from bathing and dressing to eating and, of course, relieving himself. But these weren't just practical necessities. They were carefully choreographed performances designed to reinforce his royal authority and divine connection. The king's morning routine alone took several hours and involved dozens of servants, each with specific roles and responsibilities. The groom of the stool orchestrated this entire production, ensuring that every detail reflected the proper reverence for royal dignity. The king's clothes were laid out in a specific order. His food was tasted multiple times to prevent poisoning. His chamber pot was prepared with the finest linens and sweet-smelling herbs. But the real power of the groom came from his access to the king during the most private and relaxed moments of the royal day. While other courtiers had to compete for Henry's attention during formal audiences, where every word was public and every gesture was scrutinized for political meaning, the groom had hours of unguarded conversation with the monarch. It was during these intimate moments that some of the most important decisions in English history were made. Henry's break with Rome, his dissolution of the monasteries, his marriages and divorces, all of these world-changing events were first discussed in the privacy of the royal toilet, where the king felt free to speak his mind without the constraints of royal protocol. William Compton understood this dynamic perfectly and used it to accumulate unprecedented wealth and influence. By the time of his death in 1528, he owned more land than most dukes, commanded his own private army, and served as an unofficial minister without portfolio. Foreign ambassadors reported that Compton's approval was often more important than formal authorization from the royal council. The relationship between Henry and his grooms was intensely personal and often volatile. The king demanded absolute loyalty and perfect service, but he also valued honest counsel from people who weren't afraid to tell him difficult truths. This created a dangerous balance for the grooms, who had to be simultaneously subservient and assertive, loyal and independent. Compton's successor, Henry Norris, learned this lesson the hard way. Norris had served faithfully as groom for nearly a decade when he made a fatal miscalculation. During the crisis surrounding Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn, Norris expressed private doubts about the king's treatment of his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. These comments, made in what Norris thought was the safety of the royal chamber, were reported to the king by court rivals who wanted to destroy him. Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. Norris was arrested on charges of adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn, charges that were almost certainly false but politically convenient. He was executed in 1536, becoming one of the most prominent casualties of Henry's paranoia and ruthlessness. The case demonstrated both the power and the peril of the groom's position. Intimate access to the king could make you incredibly influential, but it could also make you incredibly vulnerable. The execution of Henry Norris sent shockwaves through the court and fundamentally changed the nature of the groom's role. Subsequent holders of the position became much more cautious about expressing personal opinions or maintaining friendships that might be seen as threats to royal authority. The job had always been dangerous, but under Henry VIII, it became potentially fatal. Despite these risks, the position continued to attract ambitious and capable men who understood that the potential rewards justified the dangers. Thomas Henniga, who succeeded Norris, was a skilled diplomat and administrator who used his position to broker some of the most important international treaties of Henry's reign. Anthony Denny, the last and perhaps most influential of Henry's grooms, effectively served as the king's chief of staff during the final years of the reign, controlling access to the increasingly paranoid and isolated monarch. The power of the groom was perhaps most evident in the way Henry's government operated during his final years. By the 1540s, the king was often ill, increasingly reclusive, and suspicious of almost everyone around him. Traditional channels of government communication became unreliable as Henry withdrew from public life and relied more heavily on his private servants. Anthony Denny and his staff in the Privy Chamber became the de facto government of England. They controlled which documents reached the king, which petitions received royal attention, and which policies were actually implemented. Foreign ambassadors reported that England seemed to be governed not by the royal council or parliament, but by the king's personal servants. This concentration of power in the hands of the groom and his assistants created significant constitutional problems. Traditional checks and balances in the English government system assumed that the king would interact regularly with formal advisors like the Lord Chancellor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and senior nobles. When Henry withdrew into his private chambers and governed primarily through his personal servants, these traditional safeguards became meaningless. The situation was made even more complex by Henry's declining health and increasingly erratic behavior. The king suffered from what modern medical experts believe was a combination of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and possibly a traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. These conditions affected his judgment, his memory, and his ability to govern effectively. Anthony Denny and the other members of the Privy Chamber found themselves in the impossible position of having to manage not just the king's personal needs, but effectively the entire kingdom. They had to make crucial decisions about foreign policy, domestic governance, and succession planning, while maintaining the fiction that these decisions were coming from the king himself. The stakes could not have been higher. England was surrounded by Catholic enemies who were looking for any sign of weakness. The Protestant Reformation had created internal religious divisions that threatened civil war. The royal succession was uncertain, with Henry's only surviving son, Edward, still a child. Any mistake by the groom and his staff could have triggered national disaster. Yet despite these enormous pressures, the system worked remarkably well. Denny and his colleagues managed to maintain stability, defend England's international interests, and ensure a smooth transition of power when Henry finally died in 1547. Their success demonstrated both the effectiveness of the groom system and the extraordinary capabilities of the men who held these positions. The reign of Henry VIII represented the high point of the groom of the stool's power and influence. Never again would holders of the position wield such direct control over royal policy or command such respect from foreign governments. But the precedent they established of professional royal servants who combined intimate personal service with high-level political responsibility would influence the development of royal household management for centuries to come. As we'll see, the legacy of Henry's grooms extended far beyond their immediate historical impact. They established principles of royal service, court organization, and governmental administration that would shape the development of modern constitutional monarchy and professional civil service. Behind the formal ceremonies and public pageantry of medieval courts lay a hidden world of secret negotiations, private alliances, and carefully orchestrated power plays. The grooms of the stool were the masters of this shadow realm, wielding influence that was all the more effective for being largely invisible to outside observers. To understand how these men operated, we need to look beyond their official duties and examine the complex network of relationships, favors, and obligations that they built around their unique position. The real power of the groom wasn't just in his access to the king. It was in his ability to leverage that access into a comprehensive system of influence that touched every aspect of court life and royal governance. Consider the daily routine of Anthony Denny during the final years of Henry VIII's reign. His official responsibilities began before dawn, when he would review the king's correspondence, prepare his daily schedule, and consult with other members of the Privy Chamber about matters requiring royal attention. But his real work took place in the margins of these formal duties, in the brief conversations, quiet meetings, and subtle exchanges that shaped the direction of royal policy. A typical day might begin with a private word from the French ambassador, who needed to know Henry's real intentions regarding a proposed marriage alliance. Denny couldn't provide an official response. That would have to come through formal diplomatic channels, but he could offer hints, suggestions, and informal assurances that would guide French policy for months to come. Later in the morning, while helping the king dress, Denny might receive instructions about a sensitive personnel matter. Perhaps a particular courtier had fallen out of favor and needed to be removed from his position without public scandal. Or maybe a loyal supporter required advancement but couldn't be promoted through normal channels without creating political problems. These instructions were rarely given directly. Henry had learned, through years of political survival, to communicate his wishes through implication, suggestion, and carefully chosen words that preserved his royal dignity while ensuring his intentions were understood. Denny had to be skilled at reading between the lines, understanding not just what the king said, but what he meant and what he feared to say openly. The afternoon might bring a private meeting with Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who needed to discuss sensitive religious matters that couldn't be addressed in formal council sessions. The ongoing Protestant Reformation had created theological questions that had immediate political implications. Which religious practices should be retained? Which traditional ceremonies needed to be modified or eliminated? How could England maintain its break with Rome while avoiding the appearance of radical innovation? These discussions took place in the king's private chambers, away from the ears of courtiers who might use such information for their own political advantage. Denny served not just as a witness to these conversations, but often as a mediator, helping to find middle ground between different factions and ensuring that royal policy reflected practical political necessities rather than purely theological considerations. The evening might conclude with a visit from William Paget, the royal secretary, who needed guidance on which parliamentary bills should receive royal support and which should be quietly discouraged. Parliament was becoming increasingly important in English governance, but its relationship with royal authority was still being defined. The king needed to maintain parliamentary support without appearing to be controlled by it, a delicate balance that required careful coordination between royal servants and parliamentary leaders. Throughout all of these interactions, Denny had to maintain multiple levels of awareness and discretion. He needed to remember which information could be shared with which people, which commitments the king was prepared to honor, and which promises were merely diplomatic courtesy. He had to track the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped court politics, ensuring that his actions supported royal policy without inadvertently triggering conflicts that could destabilize the government. This level of complexity required extraordinary mental and emotional stamina. The groom of the stool couldn't afford to make mistakes, forget important details, or allow personal feelings to influence professional judgment. A single miscalculation could destroy carefully constructed alliances, undermine important policies, or even trigger international incidents. The psychological pressure was enormous. These men carried state secrets that could determine the fate of kingdoms. They knew about planned military campaigns months before they were announced, understood the real reasons behind royal marriages and divorces, and were privy to private negotiations that affected the balance of power across Europe. Yet they had to carry this knowledge lightly, maintaining the appearance of humble servants while exercising influence that rivaled that of prime ministers and foreign secretaries. They attended public ceremonies where they were largely ignored by other courtiers, knowing that these same courtiers would desperately seek their private favor later. They lived in a world where appearances and reality were constantly divergent, where the most important conversations happened in the most unlikely places. The strain of this double life affected different men in different ways. Some, like William Compton, seemed to have thrived on the complexity and challenge, using their position to build vast personal fortunes and extensive political networks. Others, like Henry Norris, were eventually destroyed by the contradictions and pressures of their role. All of them had to develop extraordinary skills in reading human nature, understanding political dynamics, and managing complex relationships. They became masters of what we might now call emotional intelligence, able to sense the king's moods, anticipate his needs, and provide exactly the right combination of support, challenge, and reassurance that each situation required. They also had to be excellent judges of character, able to distinguish between genuine allies and potential threats among the hundreds of courtiers, diplomats, and petitioners who sought their attention. The wrong friendship could be fatal, while the right alliance could secure their position for decades. Perhaps most importantly, they had to maintain absolute loyalty to the king while preserving their own moral and ethical principles. This wasn't always possible. Kings sometimes made decisions that their grooms knew were wrong, harmful, or self-destructive. The groom had to find ways to provide honest counsel while respecting royal authority, to influence policy while preserving royal dignity, to serve the king's best interests even when the king himself might not understand what those interests were. This moral complexity was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the position. The groom of the stool served not just the king as an individual, but the institution of monarchy itself. Sometimes these loyalties aligned perfectly, but sometimes they came into conflict, forcing the groom to choose between personal loyalty and institutional responsibility. The best grooms learn to navigate these moral dilemmas with skill and integrity, finding ways to serve both the king and the kingdom without compromising their own principles. They became not just servants of royal power, but guardians of royal wisdom, helping their monarchs make decisions that would stand the test of time and history. As we'll see, this combination of practical skill and moral complexity would define the legacy of the groom of the stool long after the position itself had evolved into other forms of royal service. The principles they established of loyal service combined with independent judgment, of intimate access balanced with public discretion, of personal devotion tempered with institutional responsibility, would influence the development of royal service and governmental administration for centuries to come. The relationship between a medieval king and his groom of the stool was built on absolute trust, but that same trust could become a weapon in the hands of ambitious rivals or desperate enemies. The history of the position is littered with tales of betrayal, manipulation, and the deadly consequences of knowing too much about the wrong person. The case of Henry Norris, Henry VIII's second groom of the stool, illustrates perfectly how the intimacy that made these men so powerful could also make them fatally vulnerable. Norris had served the king faithfully for nearly a decade, managing his most private affairs with discretion and skill. He had witnessed Henry's transformation from a young, charismatic monarch to an increasingly paranoid and ruthless ruler. He had seen the king's private anguish over his inability to produce a male heir, his growing obsession with Anne Boleyn, and his mounting frustration with papal opposition to his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. This intimate knowledge made Norris incredibly valuable to the king. But it also made him a target for court rivals, who understood that destroying the groom was often the surest way to influence or manipulate the monarch. In the spring of 1536, as Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn began to unravel, these rivals saw their opportunity. The charges against Norris were as shocking as they were implausible. He was accused of committing adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn, a crime that constituted high treason and carried an automatic death sentence. The evidence was thin to the point of non-existence. A few overheard conversations, some alleged glances, and the testimony of musicians and servants who had been tortured into providing convenient confessions. But the real purpose of the charges wasn't to punish actual adultery. It was to eliminate a man who knew too much about the king's private life, and who had, perhaps inadvertently, expressed doubts about royal policy at a time when absolute loyalty was demanded. Norris had the misfortune to serve a king who had learned that the surest way to keep secrets was to eliminate everyone who knew them. The speed of Norris's fall was breathtaking. One day, he was one of the most powerful men in England, controlling access to the king and managing affairs of state. The next day, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, facing charges that everyone knew were fabricated, but that no one dared to challenge. His execution in May 1536 sent shockwaves through the court and fundamentally changed the nature of royal service. The lesson was clear. Intimacy with the king was a double-edged sword that could cut both ways. Future grooms would need to be even more careful about their words, their associations, and their private opinions. The position had always been dangerous, but under Henry VIII, it became potentially fatal. Yet the dangers came not just from royal paranoia, but from the complex web of court politics that surrounded every aspect of medieval government. The groom of the stool, by virtue of his unique position, became a focal point for various factions seeking to influence royal policy. Conservative nobles who opposed religious reform sought to place their allies in the position. Protestant reformers worked to ensure that sympathetic men held the king's ear. Foreign governments attempted to buy or blackmail grooms to serve their interests. Thomas Culpeper, who briefly served in the Privy Chamber under Henry, discovered the deadly consequences of becoming entangled in these factional struggles. Culpeper was young, handsome, and ambitious, exactly the type of man who attracted the attention of court ladies seeking to advance their own positions. His fatal mistake was becoming involved with Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, in what may have been a genuine romance or simply a political manipulation designed to influence royal policy. The relationship, whether innocent or guilty, was discovered in 1541 during a routine investigation into the Queen's past. Culpeper was arrested, tortured, and eventually executed for treason. His case demonstrated that the dangers facing royal servants extended beyond their direct relationship with the king to include any personal connections that could be construed as threatening to royal authority or dignity. These executions created a climate of fear and suspicion that affected every aspect of court life. Surviving members of the Privy Chamber became increasingly cautious about their personal relationships, their private communications, and their public associations. They developed elaborate protocols for protecting themselves against false accusations, including detailed records of their activities and witnesses to their conversations. Anthony Denny, who served as groom during Henry's final years, was perhaps the most successful at navigating these dangerous waters. Denny understood that survival required not just loyal service to the king, but careful management of all the political forces that surrounded the throne. He maintained cordial relationships with all court factions while avoiding commitments that could be used against him. He kept detailed records of his activities and surrounded himself with trusted allies who could provide testimony if needed. Denny's survival strategy involved what we might now call plausible deniability. He structured his activities so that he could always claim to be following royal orders, serving institutional needs, or responding to legitimate requests from established authorities. He avoided private meetings that might be misinterpreted, personal relationships that could be seen as threats, and independent initiatives that might be construed as overstepping his authority. This defensive approach was necessary for survival, but it also limited the groom's ability to influence policy or provide honest counsel. The fear of accusation and execution made many royal servants reluctant to express dissenting opinions or challenge royal decisions, even when they believed such challenges would serve the king's best interests. The psychological impact of this atmosphere was enormous. Men who had achieved the pinnacle of court success found themselves living in constant fear of denunciation, imprisonment, and death. They had to weigh every word, analyze every relationship, and constantly assess the political implications of their most routine activities. Some adapted by becoming masters of court intrigue, learning to play the dangerous game of medieval politics with skill and cunning. Others were broken by the pressure, becoming paranoid, isolated, and ultimately ineffective. A few, like Thomas More, chose to withdraw from court service entirely rather than navigate the moral and physical dangers of royal favor. The international dimension of these dangers added another layer of complexity. Foreign governments understood that the groom of the stool was one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the English court. They constantly attempted to recruit, bribe, or blackmail these men to serve foreign interests. French agents, imperial spies, and papal representatives all sought to gain influence over the person who controlled access to the English king. These foreign approaches put the groom in an impossible position. Refusing to cooperate with foreign agents could result in blackmail or assassination attempts. Agreeing to cooperate constituted treason that would certainly result in execution if discovered. Most grooms tried to navigate this dilemma by providing harmless information that satisfied foreign curiosity without compromising English interests. But this was a dangerous balancing act that required constant vigilance. The domestic intelligence services of the time also focused heavily on monitoring the groom and his activities. Royal officials understood that foreign governments would target this position, so they maintained extensive surveillance of the groom's communications, associations, and financial activities. This created a situation where the king's most trusted servant was also one of the most watched men in the kingdom. The cumulative effect of these pressures was to create a position that was simultaneously the most desirable and the most dangerous in the medieval court. The rewards were enormous: wealth, power, influence, and the satisfaction of serving at the highest levels of government. But the risks were equally massive. Disgrace, exile, imprisonment, and death were constant possibilities for anyone who held the position. This combination of extraordinary opportunity and mortal danger attracted a specific type of person: men who were intelligent enough to understand the risks, ambitious enough to accept them, and skilled enough to navigate them successfully. The grooms of the stool were, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of modern intelligence operatives or diplomatic troubleshooters. Professionals who specialized in managing complex, sensitive, and potentially dangerous situations. their legacy extends far beyond their immediate historical impact. They established principles of crisis management, risk assessment, and strategic thinking that would influence the development of professional government service for centuries to come. More importantly, they demonstrated that even the most intimate and personal forms of service could become vehicles for wielding significant political power and influence. While the English court perfected the role of the groom of the stool, similar positions emerged across Europe as other monarchs recognized the strategic value of professional intimate servants. What began as a uniquely English institution soon spread throughout European royal courts, each adapting the concept to their own cultural traditions and political needs. The French court, always competitive with their English rivals, developed their own version called the Premier Valet de Chambre du Roi. This position combined many of the same duties as the English groom of the stool, but was integrated into the elaborate ceremony and etiquette that characterized the French monarchy. The French approach emphasized the ceremonial aspects of royal service, turning even the most mundane activities into elaborate rituals that reinforced the king's divine status. Under Louis XIV, the Sun King, the premier valet became part of an intricate system of court ceremony that governed every moment of royal life. The king's morning routine, including his most private needs, became a public performance attended by dozens of nobles who competed for the privilege of witnessing royal bodily functions. This transformed the intimate service provided by the groom into a form of public theater that simultaneously demonstrated royal power and provided opportunities for political networking. The French system was more elaborate than its English counterpart, but also more rigid and ceremonial. Where English grooms often served as informal advisors and confidants, French premier valets were expected to follow strict protocols that left little room for personal initiative or independent judgment. This difference reflected broader cultural distinctions between English and French approaches to royal authority and governmental administration. The Spanish court, influenced by both French ceremony and their own traditions of religious devotion, created the position of ayuda de cámara del rey. Spanish royal servants were expected to combine practical service with religious observance, reflecting the deeply Catholic character of Spanish monarchy. The Spanish groom was often a member of a religious order or someone with strong theological training, emphasizing the sacred nature of royal service. Spanish grooms faced unique challenges related to the global nature of the Spanish Empire. They needed to understand not just domestic court politics, but international affairs spanning from the Americas to the Philippines. The Spanish king's private chamber became a center for managing information from across the world, requiring servants who could handle correspondence in multiple languages and understand the complex relationships between different parts of the empire. The Holy Roman Empire, with its federal structure and German traditions, developed a different approach entirely. The Kammerherr served multiple functions as both personal servant and administrative officer, reflecting the more bureaucratic character of imperial government. German grooms were often trained lawyers or administrators who combined intimate service with formal governmental responsibilities. These different national approaches to royal intimate service revealed important cultural differences in how Europeans understood royal authority and governmental administration. English grooms operated in a system that valued personal loyalty and individual initiative. French premier valets served within elaborate ceremonial structures that emphasized collective participation in royal majesty. Spanish ayudas de cámara worked within religious frameworks that connected royal service to divine service. German Kammerherrs functioned as part of administrative systems that emphasized legal authority and bureaucratic efficiency. Despite these cultural differences, certain common elements emerged across European courts. Royal intimate servants everywhere became focal points for intelligence gathering and information management. They developed extensive networks of contacts that spanned national boundaries, creating informal diplomatic channels that complemented official governmental communications. The position became increasingly professionalized across Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Royal courts began to establish formal training programs for intimate servants, teaching them not just practical skills, but languages, diplomacy, finance, and military affairs. The amateur courtiers of earlier periods gave way to professional royal servants who understood their roles as specialized careers requiring specific knowledge and skills. This professionalization was driven partly by the increasing complexity of European politics and partly by competition between courts for the most capable servants. A skilled groom or premier valet could command enormous salaries and extensive privileges, making them attractive targets for recruitment by rival courts. Royal governments began to treat their intimate servants as strategic assets that needed to be protected, compensated, and retained. The international dimension of royal service became particularly important during periods of dynastic intermarriage and diplomatic negotiation. Grooms who understood multiple court cultures and spoke several languages became invaluable for managing the complex relationships between European royal families. They served as cultural translators and diplomatic intermediaries in situations where formal ambassadors might be too conspicuous or official. Consider the role played by intimate servants during the negotiations surrounding the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Dauphin of France in 1558. Scottish, French, and English grooms worked together to arrange private meetings, exchange confidential correspondence, and coordinate the elaborate ceremonies that sealed the alliance. These negotiations required understanding not just political considerations, but personal preferences, family dynamics, and cultural sensitivities that only intimate servants could provide. The growing importance of royal intimate servants also created new forms of international espionage and intelligence gathering. Foreign governments began to recruit agents specifically to target these positions, understanding that access to royal intimate servants could provide unprecedented intelligence about enemy intentions and capabilities. The Spanish, in particular, developed sophisticated networks for monitoring and influencing royal servants in Protestant countries. The Papal Inquisition maintained detailed records of intimate servants in European courts, tracking their religious beliefs, personal associations, and potential vulnerabilities. This intelligence was used to plan diplomatic initiatives, coordinate Catholic resistance movements, and identify opportunities for political manipulation. Protestant countries responded with their own intelligence operations targeting Catholic courts. English agents worked to recruit Spanish ayudas de cámara, while French Huguenots sought to influence imperial Kammerherrs. The result was a complex web of espionage and counter-espionage that centered on the most intimate servants of European royalty. This international competition for influence over royal servants led to significant innovations in counterintelligence and security procedures. Courts began to implement elaborate screening processes for intimate servants, including background investigations, loyalty tests, and ongoing monitoring of personal activities. The English, in particular, developed sophisticated procedures for protecting their grooms from foreign recruitment attempts. The financial rewards for royal intimate service increased dramatically during this period of international competition. successful grooms could accumulate fortunes that rivaled those of major nobles, while unsuccessful ones faced not just professional failure, but potential imprisonment or exile. The stakes had never been higher for the men who chose to pursue careers in royal intimate service. The social status of these positions also evolved significantly. Where early grooms had often been minor nobles grateful for any court position, their later counterparts were accomplished professionals who commanded respect throughout European society. They married into prominent families, established their own courts and households, and founded dynasties that would influence European affairs for generations. By the late 16th century, the position of royal intimate servant had become one of the most prestigious and influential careers available to ambitious European men. It offered unparalleled access to power, enormous financial rewards, and the opportunity to shape the course of European history. But it also required extraordinary skill, constant vigilance, and the ability to navigate some of the most dangerous political waters in the medieval world. The success of these men in building and maintaining their positions created models for professional government service that would influence the development of modern administrative systems. Their emphasis on personal loyalty, combined with professional competence, their integration of domestic service with international affairs, and their mastery of both ceremonial protocol and practical administration, established precedents that continue to shape royal service and governmental administration today. Behind the politics and pageantry of royal intimate service lay a sophisticated understanding of hygiene, health, and medical care that was far more advanced than most people realize. The grooms of the stool weren't just managing ceremonial duties, they were practicing a form of preventive medicine that could literally determine the fate of kingdoms. Medieval understanding of royal health was built on the belief that the king's physical condition directly affected the spiritual and political health of the realm. A sick king was seen as a sign of divine displeasure that could trigger rebellions, foreign invasions, or natural disasters. The groom of the stool, therefore, wasn't just caring for an individual, he was protecting the welfare of entire populations. This responsibility required extensive medical knowledge. Successful grooms studied the works of classical physicians like Galen and Avicenna, learned to recognize the signs of various diseases, and understood the complex relationships between diet, exercise, emotional state, and physical health. They became experts in what we would now call holistic medicine, treating the king as a complete system rather than focusing on individual symptoms. The daily examination of royal waste products was perhaps the most important diagnostic tool available to medieval physicians. The color, consistency, odor, and frequency of the king's bowel movements provided crucial information about his overall health, his diet, and his emotional state. Experienced grooms could detect signs of illness days or weeks before they became apparent through other means. This diagnostic capability had enormous political implications. If the groom detected early signs of serious illness, he could quietly arrange for medical treatment while maintaining the public appearance of royal health and strength. Enemies looking for signs of weakness would find none, while allies could be privately reassured about the king's condition and prognosis. The groom also served as the primary defense against one of the most common threats facing medieval rulers: poisoning. Royal food was tested multiple times before reaching the king, but poison could also be administered through contaminated clothing, bed linens, or even toilet paper. The groom's intimate knowledge of the king's normal bodily functions made him uniquely qualified to detect signs of poisoning and respond appropriately. Medieval texts describe elaborate procedures for protecting the king from poisoning through his most private activities. Special toilet paper made from silk or the finest linen was prepared according to strict protocols. Chamber pots were made from precious metals that were believed to neutralize certain toxins. Even the water used for royal hygiene was specially prepared and tested. The groom's medical responsibilities extended to managing the king's diet and exercise regimen. Medieval physicians understood the connection between diet and digestive health, prescribing specific foods to promote regular bowel movements and prevent various ailments. The groom worked closely with royal physicians and cooks to ensure that the king's meals supported his overall health and digestive regularity. Exercise was also considered crucial for royal health. Grooms often served as informal fitness trainers, encouraging kings to engage in appropriate physical activities and monitoring their responses to different forms of exercise. They understood that a physically healthy king was more likely to be mentally alert, emotionally stable, and politically effective. The psychological aspects of royal health were equally important. Medieval physicians recognized that emotional stress could cause physical ailments, particularly digestive problems that could be embarrassing and politically damaging. The groom served as an informal therapist, providing emotional support and practical advice during times of personal or political crisis. This therapeutic role required extraordinary interpersonal skills. The groom had to be simultaneously supportive and objective, providing emotional comfort while maintaining the clinical detachment necessary for accurate medical observation. He had to understand the king's personality, fears, and motivations well enough to provide effective counsel while avoiding the appearance of presumption or overreach. The medical knowledge required for these responsibilities was extensive and constantly evolving. Grooms studied the latest medical texts from across Europe and the Islamic world, learned from court physicians and visiting medical experts, and developed their own specialized knowledge based on years of observation and experience. Many became medical experts in their own right, consulted by physicians and scholars throughout Europe. The international exchange of medical knowledge among royal servants created informal networks that advanced medical understanding across national boundaries. English grooms shared knowledge with their French and Spanish counterparts, contributing to a body of specialized medical knowledge about royal health and hygiene that was far more sophisticated than general medical practice of the time. Some grooms made significant contributions to medical knowledge that extended far beyond their immediate royal service. They wrote treatises on digestive health, developed new treatments for common ailments, and established medical protocols that were adopted by courts throughout Europe. Their unique position gave them access to medical observations and experimental opportunities that were unavailable to other medical practitioners. The tools and techniques used by royal grooms were often centuries ahead of general medical practice. They used magnifying glasses to examine waste products for signs of disease, employed chemical tests to detect the presence of toxins, and maintained detailed medical records that allowed them to track patterns and identify potential problems before they became serious. These medical records were closely guarded state secrets that could provide enemies with valuable intelligence about royal vulnerabilities. The groom had to balance the medical value of detailed record-keeping with the security risks of creating written evidence of royal health problems. Most developed elaborate codes and shorthand systems that protected sensitive information while preserving medical data. The pharmaceutical knowledge possessed by royal grooms was equally advanced. They understood the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants, minerals, and other substances. they could prepare medications, antidotes, and treatments that were far more sophisticated than those available to ordinary physicians. Some maintained private laboratories where they conducted medical experiments and developed new treatments. This pharmaceutical expertise made the groom both a healer and a potential threat. The same knowledge that could cure the king could also be used to harm him. Royal governments were acutely aware of this paradox and implemented elaborate security measures to ensure the loyalty and integrity of royal medical servants. The medical responsibilities of the groom extended to managing royal reproductive health, particularly the crucial question of producing legitimate heirs. Medieval physicians understood the relationship between general health and fertility, prescribing treatments and lifestyle changes designed to maximize the king's reproductive capabilities. The groom often served as an intermediary between the king and specialized physicians who dealt with reproductive health. This aspect of royal service was particularly delicate and politically sensitive. The ability to produce legitimate male heirs was crucial for dynastic stability and political legitimacy. Any problems in this area could trigger succession crises that might tear the kingdom apart. The groom had to provide discreet medical support while maintaining absolute confidentiality about royal reproductive health. The accumulated medical knowledge and experience of royal grooms contributed significantly to the advancement of medical understanding throughout Europe. Their observations about the relationship between diet and health, their understanding of preventive medicine, and their diagnostic techniques influenced medical practice far beyond the royal courts. Many of the principles they established continue to influence medical practice today. The intimate nature of the groom's duties made him privy to royal secrets that could shake the foundations of kingdoms. Behind the official histories and public proclamations lay a hidden world of royal scandals, political conspiracies, and personal dramas that were known only to the most trusted servants. The grooms of the stool were the keepers of these dangerous secrets, and their discretion or indiscretion could determine the fate of dynasties. Consider the case of Edward II and his notorious relationship with Piers Gaveston. While official court records describe Gaveston as the king's loyal advisor and closest friend, the reality was far more complex and potentially explosive. The groom of the stool during this period, a man whose name has been carefully erased from most historical records, was witness to scenes that would have scandalized medieval England and provided Edward's enemies with ammunition for rebellion and regicide. The relationship between Edward and Gaveston went far beyond simple friendship or political alliance. Contemporary sources, filtered through centuries of diplomatic language and careful euphemism, hint at an intimacy that violated every social, religious, and political norm of the time. The groom who served Edward was in the unique position of witnessing this relationship firsthand, understanding its true nature, and recognizing its potentially catastrophic political implications. This knowledge placed the unnamed groom in an impossible position. His loyalty to the king demanded absolute discretion about royal private life, but his understanding of political realities told him that this secret could destroy not just Edward personally, but the entire Plantagenet dynasty. If word of the king's relationship with Gaveston became public knowledge, it could provide justification for papal condemnation, noble rebellion, and foreign invasion. The groom's response to this dilemma reveals the sophisticated political understanding that these men possessed. Rather than confronting the king directly or betraying his secrets to political rivals, he worked quietly to manage the situation in ways that protected both Edward's privacy and the kingdom's stability. He arranged for private meetings between the king and Gaveston to take place away from court, coordinated with other loyal servants to maintain official stories about their relationship, and even helped to arrange Gaveston's temporary exiles when political pressure became too great. This damage control operation required extraordinary skill and coordination. The groom had to work with a network of trusted allies throughout the royal household, ensuring that everyone involved understood their roles and maintained consistent stories. He had to anticipate potential threats, prepare contingency plans, and constantly assess the political implications of royal behavior. The ultimate failure of these efforts, Gaveston was eventually murdered by rebellious nobles in 1312, demonstrates both the limitations of even the most skilled royal servants and the enormous stakes involved in managing royal secrets. The groom's inability to protect his king's favorite contributed to a political crisis that would eventually result in Edward's deposition and murder. Similar secrets plagued other medieval monarchs, creating ongoing challenges for their grooms and intimate servants. Henry VIII's 6 marriages generated a constant stream of scandals, rumors, and dangerous secrets that required careful management. The grooms who served during this period had to navigate not just the practical challenges of royal hygiene and healthcare, but complex webs of romantic intrigue, political manipulation, and international conspiracy. The case of Catherine Howard, Henry's 5th wife, illustrates the deadly consequences of failing to manage royal scandal's effect. Catherine's relationship with Thomas Culpeper, a member of the King's Privy Chamber, was discovered in 1541 during a routine investigation into court personnel. The revelation that the Queen had been conducting a romantic relationship with a royal servant sent shockwaves through the court and triggered a massive investigation that eventually led to multiple executions. The groom of the stool during this period, Anthony Denny, faced the delicate task of managing Henry's reaction to his wife's betrayal while maintaining the stability of the royal government. Henry's rage was legendary and unpredictable. Previous queens had been executed for less serious offenses. Denny had to provide emotional support for the devastated king, while ensuring that his desire for revenge didn't destabilize the kingdom or create international incidents. Denny's success in managing this crisis demonstrates the sophisticated crisis management skills that successful grooms developed. He arranged for Catherine and her alleged lovers to be quietly arrested and investigated, ensuring that the evidence was gathered systematically and that the legal procedures were followed correctly. He coordinated with the Royal Council to ensure that government business continued normally despite the personal crisis, and he worked with court physicians to monitor Henry's health during a period of enormous emotional stress. The international dimensions of royal scandals created additional complications for the grooms who had to manage them. Foreign governments were constantly seeking intelligence about royal private life, understanding that personal scandals could be used as diplomatic weapons or propaganda tools. A royal affair, an illegitimate child, or evidence of personal weakness could be exploited by enemies to undermine royal authority and destabilize international relationships. French agents, in particular, were notorious for their efforts to gather scandalous information about English royal private life. They maintained networks of spies throughout the English court, seeking information about royal health, romantic relationships, and personal habits that could be used to French diplomatic advantage. The groom of the stool was a primary target for these intelligence operations, as his intimate knowledge of royal private life made him an invaluable potential asset. The Spanish were equally active in seeking intelligence about Protestant monarchs, understanding that evidence of personal scandal could be used to support Catholic claims about the moral corruption of heretical rulers. Papal agents worked to gather information about royal private life that could be used in propaganda campaigns designed to undermine Protestant political legitimacy. These foreign intelligence operations put enormous pressure on royal grooms, who had to resist bribes, blackmail attempts, and other forms of pressure while maintaining their loyalty to their royal masters. Some succumbed to these pressures, becoming double agents who provided foreign governments with valuable intelligence about royal private life. Others became targets for assassination or kidnapping when foreign agents determined that they couldn't be corrupted or recruited. The domestic implications of royal scandals were equally dangerous. Noble families who opposed royal policies were always looking for evidence of personal weakness or moral corruption that could justify rebellion or resistance. Religious leaders who disagreed with royal religious policies sought ammunition that could support their opposition. Even loyal supporters sometimes needed to be reassured that their king's private behavior wasn't so scandalous as to undermine the legitimacy of his rule. Managing these domestic political implications required the groom to maintain extensive networks of contacts throughout the kingdom. He needed to understand which nobles could be trusted with sensitive information, which religious leaders might use royal scandals for their own purposes, and which loyal supporters required reassurance about royal behavior. This intelligence gathering and relationship management was a full-time job that required skills that went far beyond personal service. The psychological impact of keeping royal secrets was enormous. Grooms had to live with knowledge that could destroy their kings, their kingdoms, and themselves if it became public. They carried the weight of potentially catastrophic information while maintaining the appearance of humble servants whose primary concerns were practical and mundane. Some grooms developed elaborate personal codes and moral frameworks to help them navigate these ethical dilemmas. They distinguished between secrets that protected legitimate royal privacy and secrets that concealed behavior that was genuinely harmful to the kingdom. They learned to provide honest counsel about the political implications of royal behavior, while respecting the fundamental loyalty they owed to their masters. The most successful grooms learned to see themselves not just as keepers of royal secrets, but as guardians of royal reputation and political stability. They understood that their primary responsibility was to serve the long-term interests of the monarchy as an institution, even when this sometimes conflicted with the immediate desires or preferences of individual kings. This institutional loyalty required extraordinary moral courage and political sophistication. It meant sometimes challenging royal behavior, sometimes concealing royal mistakes, and sometimes making independent decisions about how to protect royal interests. The grooms who mastered these challenges became some of the most important political figures of their age, shaping the course of European history from behind the scenes. The beginning of the end for professional royal butt wipers came not from revolution or reform, but from a gradual shift in royal culture that transformed the very nature of kingship itself. By the late 17th century, the intimate, personal monarchy that had created the need for grooms of the stool was giving way to a more formal, institutional approach to royal authority that had less need for such personal services. The transformation began during the reign of Charles II, who returned to the English throne in 1660 after the collapse of Cromwell's Commonwealth. Charles had spent his exile in the sophisticated courts of France and the Netherlands, where he had been exposed to new ideas about royal dignity, political authority, and governmental administration. When he regained his throne, he brought with him a different vision of how monarchy should operate in the modern world. Charles was still served by a groom of the stool. The position was filled by George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham, but the role had begun to evolve in significant ways. Buckingham was less of a personal servant and more of a political advisor who happened to have intimate access to the king. The practical aspects of royal hygiene were increasingly delegated to lower-ranking servants, while the groom focused on political, diplomatic, and administrative responsibilities. This shift reflected broader changes in European royal culture. The elaborate court ceremonies that had made intimate royal service a form of public theater were being replaced by more private, less ritualistic approaches to royal life. Kings were beginning to value privacy and personal autonomy more than the public demonstration of royal authority through elaborate ceremony. The scientific revolution of the 17th century also contributed to the decline of the position. New understanding of hygiene, disease, and medical care reduced the mystical significance of royal bodily functions, while increasing the importance of systematic, scientific approaches to healthcare. The groom's traditional role as a medical diagnostician was being replaced by trained physicians who had access to better knowledge and more sophisticated equipment. William III, who came to the English throne in 1688, represented the new model of European monarchy, a sophisticated political leader who understood the complexities of constitutional government and international diplomacy. William had little patience for the elaborate personal ceremonies that had characterized earlier royal courts. His groom of the stool, Arnold Joost van Keppel, functioned more like a modern chief of staff than a traditional personal servant. Keppel's responsibilities included managing royal correspondence, coordinating government meetings, and serving as an informal diplomatic liaison with foreign representatives. While he technically retained the traditional duties of the groom of the stool, these practical services were largely ceremonial by this point. The real work of the position had evolved into something approaching modern governmental administration. The final symbolic break with the traditional role came during the reign of George I, who ascended to the throne in 1714. George was German by birth and culture, unfamiliar with English court traditions, and uninterested in maintaining ceremonial practices that seemed antiquated and unnecessarily elaborate. His approach to royal service was practical, efficient, and thoroughly modern. George's groom of the stool, Melusine von der Schulenburg, was actually a woman, his longtime mistress who served as his unofficial queen and political partner. This appointment shattered the traditional male-only intimate service model that had characterized the position for centuries. Von der Schulenburg's role was entirely political and administrative. The practical aspects of royal hygiene were handled by invisible servants whose names were never recorded and whose activities were never publicly acknowledged. This feminization and politicization of the position marked the end of the groom of the stool as a unique form of royal service. Subsequent monarchs either eliminated the position entirely or transformed it into ceremonial titles that had no practical responsibilities. The age of professional royal butt wipers had finally come to an end. Several factors contributed to this transformation. The rise of constitutional monarchy reduced the king's personal authority while increasing the importance of formal governmental institutions. Parliament, the cabinet system, and professional civil service took over many of the administrative functions that had previously been handled by royal personal servants. The growing emphasis on royal privacy also eliminated many of the public ceremonies that had made intimate royal service politically significant. Kings and queens increasingly lived private family lives that were separate from their public political roles. The intimate access that had once made the groom of the stool one of the most powerful people in the kingdom became less valuable as royal private life became less politically relevant. Changes in medical understanding and hygiene practices also reduced the need for specialized royal health services. Improved sanitation, better medical knowledge, and the development of professional healthcare systems meant that royal health could be managed through normal medical channels rather than through specialized personal servants. The international dimensions that had once made royal intimate servants valuable diplomatic assets also changed during this period. Professional diplomatic services, improved communication systems, and more formal international relationships reduced the need for informal diplomatic channels through royal personal servants. Perhaps most importantly, the nature of political power itself was changing. The personal, charismatic authority that had characterized medieval kingship was being replaced by institutional, legal authority based on constitutional principles and democratic legitimacy. Royal servants were no longer political power brokers operating in the shadows of personal monarchy. They were professional administrators working within formal governmental structures. The economic changes of the early modern period also contributed to the decline of the position. The rise of commercial capitalism and professional specialization meant that capable men had many more career options than in the medieval period. The unique combination of risks and rewards that had made the groom of the stool attractive to ambitious medieval nobles became less compelling when compared to opportunities in commerce, law, military service, or colonial administration. The cultural shifts associated with the Protestant Reformation and the Scientific Revolution undermined many of the beliefs that had originally justified the position. The mystical significance of royal bodily functions, the healing power of royal touch, and the divine nature of kingship itself were all challenged by new religious and scientific ideas that emphasized rational thinking over traditional authority. By the mid-18th century, the transformation was complete. The last official groom of the stool in England was appointed in 1761, and even that appointment was purely ceremonial. The practical functions of the position had been distributed among various other servants and officials, while the political functions had been absorbed into more formal governmental structures. Yet the legacy of the groom of the stool lived on in subtle ways. The principles of loyal personal service, intimate access to power, and professional discretion that these men had developed continued to influence royal service and governmental administration. Modern equivalents can be seen in positions like private secretaries, chiefs of staff, and senior advisors who combine personal service with political responsibility. The intelligence gathering and crisis management skills that successful grooms had developed also influenced the development of modern governmental security services. The techniques they had used to protect royal secrets, manage political crises, and navigate international intrigue provided models for later intelligence and diplomatic services. Most importantly, the groom of the stool represented an early example of professional governmental service based on merit rather than birth or traditional authority. These men succeeded not because of their noble lineage or inherited wealth, but because of their skills, intelligence, and ability to manage complex political situations. This meritocratic principle would eventually become fundamental to modern civil service systems. The decline of the position also marked the end of an era in which political power operated primarily through personal relationships and informal networks. The medieval world that had created the need for professional royal butt wipers was giving way to the modern world of institutional authority, formal procedures, and systematic administration. The disappearance of professional royal butt wipers from European courts might seem like the end of a curious historical footnote, but the legacy of these remarkable men extends far beyond their immediate historical period. The principles they established, the skills they developed, and the precedents they set continue to influence governmental administration, royal service, and political organization to this day. The most obvious legacy can be seen in the evolution of modern royal households. While contemporary monarchs no longer employ professional butt wipers, they are still served by private secretaries, equerries, and personal assistants who combine intimate personal service with significant political responsibilities. These modern positions trace their lineage directly back to the medieval grooms of the stool, maintaining many of the same functions while adapting to contemporary needs and sensibilities. Consider the role of the private secretary to the British monarch, a position that emerged in the 19th century as a direct descendant of the groom of the stool. Like their medieval predecessors, private secretaries have intimate access to the monarch, manage their personal schedule and correspondence, and serve as intermediaries between the royal family and the broader political system. They must combine absolute discretion with sophisticated political judgment, exactly as the grooms did centuries before. The intelligence gathering and crisis management functions pioneered by medieval grooms also evolved into modern governmental institutions. The techniques they developed for protecting sensitive information, managing political crises, and coordinating with various governmental and international actors provided early models for modern intelligence services, diplomatic corps, and crisis management systems. The British Secret Intelligence Service, established in the early 20th century, adopted many organizational principles that can be traced back to the informal intelligence networks maintained by medieval grooms. The emphasis on personal loyalty, combined with professional competence, the use of intimate access to gather sensitive information, and the coordination of domestic and international intelligence activities all reflect lessons learned during the age of royal intimate servants. Modern diplomatic services also show the influence of medieval groom traditions. The concept of diplomatic immunity, the emphasis on personal relationships in international negotiations, and the use of unofficial channels for sensitive communications, all developed from practices pioneered by royal intimate servants, who served as informal ambassadors and diplomatic intermediaries. The administrative principles established by successful grooms influenced the development of modern civil service systems throughout Europe and beyond. Their emphasis on merit-based appointment, professional competence, and institutional loyalty over personal connections helped establish precedents for governmental efficiency and effectiveness that continue to shape public administration today. The concept of professional governmental service as a specialized career requiring specific skills and training, rather than simply a reward for noble birth or political connections, was largely pioneered by medieval grooms who demonstrated that the most sensitive and important governmental functions could be performed effectively by individuals chosen for their capabilities rather than their social status. Modern corporate management also shows the influence of medieval royal service traditions. The concept of the chief executive officer, who combines operational management with strategic planning, the importance of managing both internal operations and external relationships, and the emphasis on personal loyalty combined with professional competence all reflect lessons learned in medieval royal courts. The crisis management techniques developed by grooms facing life-and-death political situations provided early models for modern corporate crisis management, public relations, and strategic communications. The ability to maintain operational stability while managing external threats, to coordinate multiple stakeholders during emergencies, and to balance transparency with discretion are skills that translate directly from medieval courts to modern organizations. The psychological and emotional support functions that grooms provided to stressed monarchs also influenced the development of modern counseling and therapeutic services. The understanding that effective leadership requires emotional stability, that personal problems can have professional consequences, and that trusted advisors can provide valuable emotional support are insights that remain relevant in contemporary leadership development and executive coaching. The medical and healthcare innovations pioneered by grooms contributed to the development of preventive medicine and personalized healthcare. Their emphasis on understanding individual health patterns, their use of detailed health records for diagnostic purposes, and their integration of physical and emotional health considerations provided early models for holistic medical practice. Even the security protocols developed to protect medieval grooms influenced modern personal protection and executive security services. The techniques they used to assess and manage threats, to maintain operational security while preserving personal access, and to coordinate with various protective agencies, establish precedents that continue to influence contemporary security practices. The international dimensions of medieval royal service also provided early models for modern multinational organizations and global governance systems. The informal networks that connected grooms across different European courts, the coordination of activities across national boundaries, and the management of competing loyalties and interests are challenges that remain relevant in contemporary international organizations. Perhaps most importantly, the groom of the stool represented an early example of how intimate personal relationships can be vehicles for wielding significant political power and influence. This insight remains relevant in contemporary politics, where personal access to key decision-makers often matters more than formal institutional authority. The success of medieval grooms in building and maintaining these influential personal relationships while preserving their professional integrity provides valuable lessons for contemporary political operatives, lobbyists, and governmental advisors. The balance they achieved between personal service and independent judgment, between loyalty and objectivity, between discretion and transparency, continues to define effective political service. Their legacy also includes important cautionary lessons about the dangers of concentrating too much informal power in unaccountable personal servants. The political crises that resulted when grooms abused their positions or when their personal interests conflicted with broader governmental interests provide warnings that remain relevant for contemporary democracies struggling to balance efficiency with accountability. The gender implications of the groom tradition also deserve consideration. The exclusively male character of medieval royal intimate service reflected broader assumptions about gender roles and political participation that began to change only in the modern period. The gradual inclusion of women in similar roles during the 18th and 19th centuries marked important steps toward gender equality in governmental service. Modern scholarship on the groom of the stool has revealed the extent to which these seemingly humble servants shaped the course of European history through their influence on royal decision-making. Their stories provide important reminders that history is often made not by the famous figures who appear in textbooks, but by the skilled professionals who work behind the scenes to make complex systems function effectively. The meticulous record-keeping that characterized successful grooms also established precedents for governmental documentation and archival practices that continue to influence how modern governments preserve and manage information. Their understanding that detailed records could be both valuable assets and dangerous liabilities remains relevant for contemporary information management and security practices. As we reflect on the legacy of medieval royal butt wipers, we see that their influence extended far beyond the intimate services they provided to their royal masters. They were innovators in governmental administration, pioneers in international relations, and masters of the complex arts of political service that continue to shape how power is exercised and managed in the modern world. As we reach the end of our journey through the hidden world of medieval royal butt wipers, we must confront some uncomfortable truths about power, intimacy, and the price of absolute authority. The story of the Groom of the Stool reveals fundamental aspects of human nature and political organization that remain relevant today, even as the specific institution has vanished into history. The most disturbing truth about the Groom of the Stool is what it reveals about the nature of medieval kingship itself. These weren't just political leaders or military commanders. They were human beings who had been so elevated above normal society that they required professional assistance for the most basic human functions. The existence of the position demonstrates the profound psychological and social costs of absolute power, both for those who wielded it and for those who served it. Medieval kings lived in a world where every moment was public, every action was scrutinized for political meaning, and every human weakness was a potential source of political vulnerability. They couldn't eat, sleep, pray, or even relieve themselves without considering the political implications of their actions. The Groom of the Stool was necessary not just because kings were lazy or privileged, but because they had been so dehumanized by the demands of absolute authority that they had lost the ability to function as normal human beings. This dehumanization extended beyond the kings themselves to the men who served them. The Groom of the Stool had to subordinate his own dignity, his own moral principles, and often his own survival instincts to the demands of royal service. He became, in many ways, as much a prisoner of the system as the king he served. The wealth, power, and influence that came with the position were compensation for a fundamental sacrifice of personal autonomy and moral independence. The psychological profiles of successful grooms reveal men who had learned to find satisfaction and meaning in forms of service that most people would find degrading or intolerable. They had to develop psychological defense mechanisms that allowed them to maintain their self-respect while performing duties that society considered beneath the dignity of free men. This psychological adaptation was perhaps their most remarkable achievement and their most troubling legacy. The international competition for influence over royal intimate servants also reveals disturbing truths about the nature of medieval diplomacy and statecraft. Foreign governments understood that the most effective way to influence royal policy was often through the corruption or manipulation of the men who had intimate access to royal decision-making. This created a shadow world of espionage, bribery, and blackmail that operated alongside official diplomatic channels. The willingness of some grooms to betray their royal masters for foreign gold or political advantage demonstrates the moral compromises that were inherent in a system based on personal loyalty rather than institutional accountability. The same intimate access that made these men valuable to their kings also made them valuable to their enemies. The temptations they faced were enormous, and not all of them proved strong enough to resist. The medical aspects of the groom's duties also reveal uncomfortable truths about medieval approaches to health and royal authority. The belief that royal bodily waste possessed healing properties wasn't just superstition. It was part of a broader system of magical thinking that justified absolute monarchy by claiming divine sanction for royal authority. The groom's participation in these medical rituals made him complicit in maintaining political systems based on deception and manipulation. The diagnostic capabilities that grooms developed through their intimate knowledge of royal bodily functions could be used not just to protect royal health, but to conceal royal weakness and deceive potential rivals. A skilled groom could help maintain the public appearance of royal strength and vitality, even when the king was seriously ill or dying. This deception served the immediate interests of political stability, but it also prevented the natural processes of political succession and adaptation that might have served the longer-term interests of the kingdom. The secrecy that surrounded royal intimate service also enabled abuse and corruption that might have been prevented by more transparent systems of governmental accountability. Kings who knew that their most private activities were protected by absolute loyalty from their intimate servants were free to engage in behavior that might be politically dangerous or morally questionable without fear of exposure or consequences. The case studies we've examined reveal instances where grooms use their positions to cover up royal crimes, conceal evidence of royal incompetence, or facilitate royal activities that were harmful to the kingdom's interests. The loyalty that made these men valuable servants sometimes made them accomplices in activities that violated their own moral principles and the broader interests of justice and good government. The economic aspects of royal intimate service also reveal troubling patterns of corruption and inequality. The enormous wealth that successful grooms could accumulate was often derived not from productive economic activity, but from their ability to exploit their privileged access to royal authority. They could use royal favor to secure monopolies, extract bribes, and manipulate governmental decisions for their own financial benefit. This economic parasitism was often invisible to contemporary observers, who saw only the public service and ceremonial duties that grooms performed. The real source of their wealth and influence remained hidden behind the veil of royal privacy and ceremonial protocol. This created a system where some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the kingdom owed their positions not to their contributions to society, but to their willingness to perform intimate services for absolute rulers. The gender dynamics inherent in the groom system also reveal disturbing assumptions about masculinity, dignity, and political participation. The exclusively male character of royal intimate service reinforced ideas about male political dominance, while simultaneously requiring men to perform duties that were considered feminine in character. This created complex psychological tensions that affected not just individual grooms, but broader cultural understandings of gender roles and political authority. The racial and ethnic dimensions of royal intimate service, while less well documented, also deserve consideration. The international recruitment of grooms and their use in diplomatic activities reflected broader patterns of cultural exchange and conflict that often involved the exploitation of minority populations and the reinforcement of ethnic hierarchies. As we consider these uncomfortable truths, we must also acknowledge the remarkable achievements of the men who held these positions. Despite the moral compromises and psychological costs involved, many grooms succeeded in serving their kings and kingdoms with integrity, intelligence, and effectiveness. They navigated impossible situations with skill and courage, often serving as the only check on royal power and the only source of honest counsel available to absolute monarchs. Their legacy includes not just the governmental and administrative innovations they pioneered, but also the moral example they provided of service that transcended personal dignity in pursuit of larger purposes. The best grooms understood that their sacrifices served not just their individual kings, but the institution of monarchy and the broader interests of political stability and effective government. Yet we cannot ignore the fundamental contradictions and moral compromises that were inherent in their positions. The story of the Groom of the Stool is ultimately a story about the human costs of absolute power and the moral complexities that arise when political systems require individuals to sacrifice their personal dignity and moral autonomy in service of larger political goals. These contradictions remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions about the proper relationship between personal loyalty and institutional accountability, between efficient government and democratic transparency, between effective leadership and moral integrity. The medieval grooms of the stool faced these dilemmas in their most extreme form, and their successes and failures provide valuable lessons for contemporary political leaders and public servants. As we close this investigation into one of history's most peculiar and powerful positions, we're left with questions that extend far beyond the medieval courts, where professional royal butt wipers once wielded extraordinary influence. The story of the Groom of the Stool forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, loyalty, and the price we're willing to pay for political stability and effective leadership. For over 400 years, these men operated in the shadows of European history, shaping the decisions of kings, influencing the fate of nations, and pioneering forms of governmental service that continue to influence political organization today. They were simultaneously the most intimate servants and the most powerful advisors in their kingdoms, combining personal humility with political sophistication in ways that seem almost impossible from our modern perspective. Their story reveals the profound human costs of absolute monarchy, not just for the subjects who lived under royal authority, but for the kings themselves and the servants who attended them. Medieval monarchs, elevated so far above normal human society that they required professional assistance for basic bodily functions, became prisoners of their own power, isolated from normal human relationships and dependent on carefully managed systems of service and support. The grooms who served these isolated monarchs faced equally profound challenges. They had to find meaning and satisfaction in forms of service that required the sacrifice of personal dignity and moral independence. They had to balance competing loyalties between individual kings and institutional interests, between immediate practical needs and longer-term political consequences, between personal survival and professional responsibility. Yet, despite these challenges, the best grooms succeeded in creating something remarkable, a form of political service that combined intimate personal loyalty with sophisticated professional competence. They demonstrated that effective government often depends not on formal institutions and official procedures, but on the quality of personal relationships and the integrity of individual servants who are willing to subordinate their own interests to larger purposes. Their innovations in crisis management, intelligence gathering, diplomatic communication, and administrative coordination provided early models for many of the governmental functions that we now take for granted. Modern civil service systems, intelligence agencies, diplomatic corps, and executive support systems all trace aspects of their development to lessons learned in medieval royal courts by men whose primary job was cleaning royal bottoms. The international dimensions of their service also prefigured many contemporary challenges of global governance and international cooperation. The informal networks that connected grooms across different European courts, their role in managing competing national interests, and their experience in coordinating activities across cultural and linguistic boundaries established precedents for modern international organizations and multinational institutions. Perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates the complex relationships between power and service, between leadership and loyalty, between public authority and private integrity that continue to shape political life in democratic societies. The moral dilemmas they faced, when to speak truth to power, how to balance competing loyalties, whether to prioritize immediate stability or longer-term justice, remain relevant for contemporary public servants, political advisors, and governmental officials. The decline and disappearance of the Groom of the Stool marked not just the end of a curious historical institution, but the conclusion of an entire approach to political organization based on personal monarchy and intimate service. The rise of constitutional government, professional civil service, and democratic accountability eliminated the need for the unique combination of personal loyalty and political sophistication that these men represented. Yet their legacy persists in subtle ways throughout modern political systems. The importance of personal relationships in political decision-making, the value of loyal and discreet advisors, the need for crisis management and strategic thinking, the challenges of balancing transparency with security. All of these contemporary political realities were anticipated and addressed by medieval royal servants who understood that effective government often depends on the quality of individual relationships and the integrity of personal s. Their story also provides important warnings about the dangers of concentrating too much informal power in unaccountable personal servants, the risks of substituting personal loyalty for institutional oversight, and the moral costs of political systems that require individuals to sacrifice their dignity and autonomy in service of abstract political goals. As we face contemporary challenges of political leadership, governmental accountability, and public service, we can learn valuable lessons from these remarkable men who served their kings and kingdoms with such skill, dedication, and complexity. Their successes show us the potential for meaningful public service, even in the most challenging circumstances. Their failures warn us about the dangers of unchecked power and unaccountable authority. The medical innovations they pioneered remind us of the importance of preventive care and personalized attention to individual health needs. The intelligence-gathering techniques they developed anticipate many contemporary approaches to information management and strategic analysis. The diplomatic skills they demonstrated remain relevant for international negotiations and cross-cultural communication. Most importantly, their moral example, at its best, shows us the possibility of finding dignity and meaning in service to larger purposes, even when that service requires personal sacrifice and moral complexity. They demonstrated that political leadership often depends on the willingness of skilled and dedicated individuals to work behind the scenes without recognition or reward to make complex systems function effectively and serve the common good. The story of medieval royal butt wipers is ultimately a story about the human dimension of political power, the individual relationships, personal sacrifices, and moral choices that determine whether governmental systems serve their intended purposes or become instruments of corruption and oppression. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by famous leaders and dramatic events, but by the countless individuals who work in obscurity to maintain the systems and relationships on which political stability and effective government depend. As you consider this strange and fascinating chapter of European history, ask yourself, what would you sacrifice for access to power? How do you balance personal dignity with professional responsibility? When is loyal service a virtue? And when does it become complicity in injustice? What lessons from this vanished world of medieval courts might apply to the political challenges we face today? The professional royal butt wipers of medieval Europe have been dead for centuries, but the questions they faced and the dilemmas they navigated remain as relevant today as they were in the chambers of medieval palaces. Their story challenges us to think more deeply about the nature of political service, the costs of effective leadership, and the moral complexities that arise whenever individuals are asked to subordinate their personal interests to larger political purposes. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson from the age of royal butt wipers is this: behind every great political system, every effective leader, and every stable government are countless individuals whose names history never records, but whose service, sacrifice, and moral choices make civilization possible. The grooms of the stool were the most visible representatives of this invisible army of public servants, and their story reminds us to honor the dignity and importance of all those who serve, regardless of the nature of their duties or the recognition they receive. The next time you encounter someone in public service, whether they're cleaning restrooms, managing schedules, or advising presidents, remember the grooms of the stool and the remarkable legacy of professional service they represent. In their willingness to find meaning and dignity in the most humble duties, they demonstrated something fundamental about human nature and political organization that remains true today. Effective government depends not on the grandeur of its ceremonies or the eloquence of its rhetoric, but on the quality of its servants and the integrity of those who are willing to serve. The age of professional royal butt wipers may be over, but the need for dedicated, skilled, and morally courageous public servants continues. Their legacy lives on in everyone who chooses service over self-interest, who finds dignity in humble duties, and who works behind the scenes to make our complex world function more effectively and humanely. Subscribe to explore more hidden histories and forgotten stories that shaped our world. The past is full of surprises, and the most remarkable tales are often the ones we never expected to hear.